How could a people of conquerors, forged by iron and storms, have gone extinct? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today, we are tracing the footsteps of a people who made Europe tremble, the Vikings. Their name evokes lightning raids, longships cutting through the sea, and fierce battles under a steel sky. For centuries, they imposed their will, defying kings and empires, and extending their influence from the icy shores of North America to the banks of the Black Sea. But how could such a formidable people have disappeared? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and enjoy your journey. At the turn of the 8th and 9th centuries, the world presented itself as a vast space with multiple dynamics, where several civilizations, to varying degrees of development and expansion, wove a network of often surprising relationships. The legacies of great empires that had fallen or were in transition fueled emerging kingdoms that sought to consolidate their power. In Western Europe, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 led to a complex process of political and social reorganization. With the central authority of Rome gone, various peoples then deemed barbarians, or Germanic, such as the Visigoths, the Franks, the Ostrogoths, or the Vandals, gradually founded their own kingdoms on the institutional ruins of the empire. Despite the fall of Roman power, a persistent Romanization was observed. The Latin language continued to be used in administrative and religious functions, while many infrastructures inherited from the imperial era, bridges, roads, aqueducts, served as a foundation for the organization of these emerging kingdoms. Christianity, deeply rooted in society, gradually supported the structuring of social order and guaranteed a certain spiritual link between these new political entities and the old Roman culture. The figure of the bishop, for example, occupied a crucial politico-religious role, partly inheriting the moral preeminence once attributed to the church's representatives under Rome. Within these former territories of the empire, a people gradually stood out, the Franks. Present since the Roman Empire, they achieved a first political unification under the Merovingian dynasty, named after their legendary ancestor Merovech. Kings like Clovis at the end of the 5th century undertook conversion to Christianity, consolidated laws inspired by Germanic and Roman customs, and established their capitals in northern Gaul, a region that would later become the heart of France. However, the Merovingian dynasty suffered from chronic instability. Palace intrigues, divisions of the kingdom among heirs, and fratricidal struggles regularly weakened the central power. It was in this context that the Carolingian lineage emerged, founded on the growing influence of the mayors of the palace, officials who gradually held the actual authority. Charles Martel, famous for his victory over the Umayyad forces at Poitiers in 732, solidified the image of a Frankish power defending Christendom. His son Pepin the Short usurped the royal title in 751, formally ending the Merovingian reign. Then his grandson Charlemagne elevated the Frankish power to an unprecedented level. Crowned emperor in the year 800 by the Pope, he established what is commonly called the Carolingian Empire, uniting under his scepter a large part of Western Europe. Charlemagne implements a more rigorous administration by appointing counts responsible for managing the counties and missi dominici, itinerant envoys tasked with inspecting the provinces. He promotes cultural reform and education. This is known as the Carolingian Renaissance, by bringing together scholars and clerics around the court. At the same time, military expansion unfolds towards Saxony in today's northern Germany, the Lombards in northern Italy, and the Spanish Marches. Deep Christian religion and papal recognition cement Charlemagne's legitimacy, whose throne unites the values of the fallen Roman Empire and Christian fervor. This cultural and political synthesis increases Frankish influence in the West, resulting in the emergence of a new center of power. But upon Charlemagne's death in 814, the empire quickly faces succession difficulties. His heirs struggle to maintain the unity of such a vast territory. Ultimately, the Treaty of Verdun in 843 establishes the division into three distinct kingdoms: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia, paving the way for future political identities like France and Germany. This fragmentation also has strategic consequences. Borders become more vulnerable to external aggressions. The emergence of new enemies, such as the Vikings in the north, the Saracens in the south, and the Magyars in the east, presents a complex defense challenge for each part of the former Carolingian Empire. Further east lies the other inheritor of Rome, the Byzantine Empire. Since the founding of Constantinople by the Roman Emperor Constantine I in the 4th century, the Eastern Roman Empire has gradually diverged from the Western one. When Rome falls in 476, Byzantium remains standing and becomes the main bearer of the Roman legacy. Rich, urban, and cultured, it preserves the Greco-Roman heritage, both in language, where Greek increasingly prevails, and in legal and intellectual culture. Strategically located on the Bosphorus, Constantinople stands as the capital of a Christian Orthodox empire that perpetuates a centralized administration and a lavish court. Byzantine art, known for its icons, mosaics, and sumptuous buildings, shines throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine emperors, surrounded by a complex bureaucracy, control a network of military themes, regional divisions, intended to maintain order and defense. This imperial force, however, must face numerous border pressures: the Slavic world, moving towards the Balkans, and the Arab Islamic powers which, within a few decades, conquer Syria, Egypt, and regularly threaten Anatolia. To the northwest of Byzantium, Slavic peoples settle in the Balkans starting from the 6th to the 7th century, transforming the demographic and political landscape. The Byzantine Empire at times forges alliances, at times wages wars to contain these migrations, while in the east, it suffers repeated offensives from armies stemming from the Islamic expansion. Since the advent of Islam in the 7th century, Arab conquests have drastically reduced Byzantine control over the Near East and North Africa. Formerly crucial provinces, such as agricultural Egypt or commercial Syria, fall under Muslim rule. The Byzantine Empire then redefines its priorities, withdrawing to Anatolia and using its naval resources to protect its capital. Despite these territorial losses, Byzantium remains a major center of literary and artistic production, while demonstrating a great political resilience that will allow it, for several more centuries, to play a key role in the balances of the Eastern Mediterranean. This position of Byzantium on the Mediterranean, at the junction between Europe and Asia, makes it a unique commercial crossroads. Constantinople attracts merchants and adventurers from all backgrounds, as the city is renowned for its wealth and network of trade. Luxury goods like silk imported from the Far East pass through its markets. Arab, Persian, Armenian, and sometimes Scandinavian merchants find lucrative opportunities there, fueling the prosperity of the city. The Byzantine elites grant privileges to certain foreign traders, aware that the influx of golden goods contributes to the empire's radiance. Simultaneously, this commercial effervescence contributes to spreading, gradually, ideas, know-how, and techniques to Western Europe, the nascent Kievan Rus, and the Muslim world. Byzantium then acts as an intercultural bridge, sometimes playing the role of diplomatic and artisanal relay between the vast spaces of the old continent. For its part, the Islamic world has been experiencing spectacular expansion since the first half of the 7th century, driven by the new faith preached by the Prophet Muhammad, who died in 632. This religion quickly unifies the once scattered Arab tribes around a common vision. The first waves of conquests, under the reign of the Rashidun caliphs, captured major cities like Damascus in 635, Jerusalem in 638, and Alexandria in 642. The Arab armies then pushed eastward to Persia and westward to North Africa. In 711, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar gave birth to the Andalusian epic, which would change the cartography of the Iberian Peninsula. Everywhere these conquerors settled, one observes the spread of Arabic as the administrative language, the construction of mosques, and the establishment of an organized fiscal system. Christian and Jewish inhabitants are considered people of the book and receive protected status in exchange for a special tax. On the dynastic front, after several internal quarrels, the Umayyad family founded a caliphate centered in Damascus in 661. They ruled until 750, when the Abbasid revolution overthrew their power. The Abbasids chose Baghdad as the new capital, marking the advent of a cultural and scientific golden age. Built on a circular plan, Baghdad quickly became one of the world's largest cities, renowned for its schools, libraries, and its taste for arts and literature. Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions fused there, while the court supported renowned thinkers, such as translators of philosophical or medical texts. The city, prosperous thanks to river trade on the Tigris and caravan routes crossing the desert, embodied the political and intellectual heart of medieval Islam. This Abbasid caliphate also stands out for the scope of its commercial trade networks. From Baghdad, merchants traverse Mesopotamia, Arabia, East Africa, and even reach Central Asia. Spices, gold, precious stones, and silks circulate on land and sea routes, enriching traders and stopover towns. Caravanserais, establishments designed to accommodate merchants and their caravans, multiply along routes leading to Persia or Transoxiana. Meanwhile, on the Mediterranean coast, ships laden with luxury products dock at the ports of Alexandria or Tyre, where goods transit before heading to the west or Byzantium. Silver coins minted in the Muslim world occasionally reach Scandinavia, where they are hoarded by Viking merchants, captivated by the quality and purity of Eastern currencies. Thus, even the Nordic regions indirectly experience the influence of Islamic radiance in the economic sphere. In Asia, the Tang dynasty stands as another monumental period of prosperity and refinement. Considered one of the most splendid eras in Chinese imperial history, it is characterized by strong administrative centralization and a highly influential literati elite. The Tang emperors supported a meritocratic administration based on imperial examinations, ensuring the loyalty of competent officials. The capital, Chang'an, today's Xi'an, was remarkable for its impressive size. It was one of the most populated cities in the world, organized into well-defined districts with markets dedicated to products from all origins. The imperial court encouraged the arts, religion, and notably Buddhism, which spread throughout the empire. Militarily, the Tang extended their influence towards Central Asia, controlling strategic oases and ensuring a safe environment for trade. In India, the period was marked by the rise of the Chalukya Empire in the south and the Pala Empire in the east, while the north saw the rise of the Pratiharas, engaged in a power struggle with the Arabs and other local kingdoms. Buddhism, although declining in India, remained influential due to major monastic centers like Nalanda, while Hinduism developed through the construction of monumental temples and the codification of religious traditions. Advances in mathematics and astronomy reflected the intellectual dynamism of the period, laying the foundations for discoveries that would later influence the Arab and European worlds. The famous Silk Road, a network of trade routes winding from China to the Mediterranean, was at this time a major conduit for the spread of goods, as well as ideas and techniques. Delicate silks, precious porcelains, tea, and certain metallurgical processes attracted the interest of Muslim and Byzantine merchants, and by extension, all those who sought to acquire or intercept these treasures. The Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians in Byzantine and Russian chronicles, would later take routes that joined, at the end of the chain, these commercial flows. On the African continent, the political and cultural diversity is also remarkable. In the Horn of Africa, the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which had peaked in the 4th, 6th centuries, gradually declined while maintaining commercial links in the Red Sea. Ethiopia maintained interactions with the neighboring Muslim world, trading gold, ivory, skins, and slaves, while new regional political entities emerged. The arrival of Arab merchants on the coast, especially around the port city of Adulis, transformed trade routes in favor of a growing Islamic maritime trade. Nonetheless, these contacts maintained a certain cultural and religious continuity. Ethiopian Christianity, deeply rooted, coexisted with Muslim flows in transit, thus forging a unique identity in the region. In the Sudanese zone in West Africa, political entities began to emerge, laying the groundwork for what would later become the great empires such as Ghana, or Ouagadougou, Mali, and Songhai. Before Ghana, pre-existing kingdoms traded gold and salt with North African merchants, who in turn introduced manufactured goods and techniques, sometimes inspired by Arabs or Berbers. Camel caravans crossed the Sahara, linking Sahel tribal chiefs to Maghreb capitals. The flows of gold or ivory stimulated the Mediterranean economy, while local rulers, aware of the prestige conferred by this wealth, developed a ruling elite capable of forging lasting alliances. Even though Western Europe did not directly benefit from these trans-Saharan circuits, the impacts on precious metal prices and the financing of distant expeditions were real and contributed to integrating Africa into these large exchange movements. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, pre-Columbian civilizations followed a completely distinct path due to the isolation of the American continent. In Mesoamerica, the Mayas reached their so-called classic period between the 3rd and 9th centuries, erecting majestic cities in the jungle such as Tikal or Palenque, and practicing sophisticated astronomy. The Zapotecs, located further south in the Oaxaca Valley, developed their own writing systems and religious institutions. In these regions, the science of calendars, pyramid architecture, and complex rituals suggest a high level of socio-political organization. In the Andes region, cultures predating the Incas, such as the Chavin, Moche, Nazca, or Tiahuanaco civilizations, have already left impressive remnants. Finely decorated pottery, geoglyphs engraved into the desert, or grand ceremonial sites. These Andean societies often rely on the domestication of llamas and alpacas, terrace agriculture, and the worship of deities linked to the mountains. However, their geographical isolation, separated from Eurasian trade routes by the Atlantic Ocean, keeps them away from the political and economic dynamics that stir the Old World. The knowledge and inventions of Asia, Africa, or Europe have no opportunity to cross the vast maritime expanses to reach these societies. At the northern end of Europe, the Scandinavians, future Vikings, reside in a vast northern space, still largely unknown to other European peoples. Before the 8th century, the territories of present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are distant from the major centers of European power. Rome, followed by the Frankish kingdoms, pays little attention to these northern regions considered remote and inhospitable. Locally, the inhabitants live in modest communities, sometimes grouped around a local chieftain. There are certainly the beginnings of kingdoms. Some legends mention Danish or Swedish kings, but overall, the political scene remains fragmented. Familial ties, warrior prestige, and geographical position often play a more decisive role than the assertion of a true, centralized authority. This dispersed situation is partly explained by the terrain and the capricious nature of the climate. Internal communications are difficult, and groups tend to retreat to a valley, a coast, or a small insular cluster. The Proto-Nordic tribes, whose heritage dates back to the large group of Germanic peoples, retain their own traditions, transmitted from generation to generation orally. These customs regulate collective life and frame religious rites, land distribution, and military obligations. Within these communities, a chieftain's legitimacy relies more on his ability to protect his group and distribute wealth than to impose written laws or a structured hierarchy. The early Germanic languages, ancestors of Old Norse, gradually develop, enriched with regional particularities. Through ancient runic inscriptions, it is observed that the Proto-Nordics already honor certain gods that will later appear in the Viking pantheon. However, it should be noted that these beliefs remain very local, and that there is no unified religious organization capable of overseeing the entire of Scandinavia. This climate of autonomy and subtle rivalry between clans and Proto-Nordic kingdoms reveals the absence of a grand capital or major power center. Regional kings, or chiefs, rely more on a network of fortified farms, hamlets, and shifting allegiances. The whole resembles a mosaic, where each entity adapts to the realities of its micro-territory. This political multiplicity will later influence the Viking mentality, proud of both their independence and, more importantly, quick to unite around charismatic leaders when the opportunity to raid or trade arises. To understand the Scandinavians, one must picture the setting in which they are born and evolve. Norway, with its rugged coastlines, opens onto the North Atlantic. Its countless fjords form natural sea routes, deep and sheltered, allowing access inland. Between these sea arms, the mountainous terrain and hard-to-reach valleys limit the available area for agriculture. In Sweden, vast forests and lakes dot the landscape, offering resources in wood and game, but leaving little open space for intensive farming. Denmark, on the other hand, presents a flatter landscape with more fertile agricultural land, though it remains exposed to the North Sea winds and tides. The winters are long and harsh, the storms frequent, and the temperature fluctuations drastic. It is not uncommon, especially in Norway, for several months of darkness and cold to paralyze daily life. This harshness instills in the inhabitants a keen sense of survival and family solidarity. Food reserves must be planned in advance, and the slightest negligence can prove fatal. Wooden constructions, often covered with turf or thatch, are designed to better withstand the cold and bad weather. Proximity to fresh water sources, temporary pastures, and of course, the coast is preferred, as the sea remains a vital communication route. To this demanding environment is added the proximity of crucial maritime basins, the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. From time immemorial, the riparian populations have exchanged essential goods such as salt, dried fish, furs, and even amber, extracted from the shores of the Baltic Sea. Access to the Atlantic also opens the door to more distant horizons. Pre-Viking Scandinavian society is organized according to different strata, each occupying a specific role. At the top of this informal hierarchy are the jarls, that is, the ruling aristocracy. The jarls are above all clan chiefs and landowners who exercise significant local power. They often own the best arable lands or control strategic crossing points. Their authority is based on their ability to protect their entourage and redistribute the spoils obtained during conflicts or trade transactions. The jarls maintain personal ties with their warriors and close advisors. In this world, where loyalty is sometimes bought with gold, having sufficient wealth to reward followers is a guarantee of stability and survival. Below this aristocracy are the carls, the most numerous social category, which includes free men. The carls are farmers, artisans, merchants, or sailors, and they constitute the productive base of society. Each of them manages their farm, forge, or boat, and they enjoy certain rights, including the right to bear arms and participate in local assemblies. The carls are not servilely subject to a jarl. They can choose their allegiance and band together to defend their own interests. This relative freedom is also manifested in mobility. A carl skilled in navigation or trade can become wealthy and climb the social ladder, although these ascensions remain rare given the weight of established lineages. At the base of the pyramid are the thralls, that is, slaves. They are often captured during raids or purchased from other peoples, then integrated into farms or workshops. The thralls perform the most laborious tasks: agricultural work, livestock care, domestic chores, even participating in shipbuilding. Unlike the carls, they cannot own land or have political or legal rights. However, the status of a thrall is not always permanent. In some cases, a particularly loyal or worthy slave can be freed. Nevertheless, most remain attached to their masters and have little hope of improving their situation. This servile labor force, at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, plays an essential economic role. It allows the jarls and affluent carls to exploit their lands or resources more efficiently, freeing up time for prestigious activities such as military training or participation in raids. The existence of these three groups, jarls, carls, and thralls, does not exclude nuances. There are affluent carls, less influential jarls, and the condition of thralls can vary depending on the region. Nevertheless, this triptych profoundly marks Scandinavian society. It shapes the mechanisms of power, the rural economy, and the distribution of wealth before the Viking period comes to disrupt some balances. The relations between these groups are regulated by oral traditions, codes of honor, and, of course, collective assemblies. A fundamental pillar of Scandinavian governance is found in the Thing, the assembly of free men. Each region organizes its local thing, and some major annual gatherings, such as the Althing in Iceland from the 9th century, although it became more formalized later, become genuine political and religious events. At the Thing, current affairs are discussed, conflicts are resolved, judgments are pronounced, and decisions regarding the community are made. All adult carls can speak or express their opinion, although in practice, the jarls and influential families carry more weight in the debates. This more or less democratic dimension is found in the fact that the authority of a leader relies less on coercion than on the ability to convince or gain consensus. Decisions adopted at the Thing are considered legitimate because they result from public agreement. Disputes are arbitrated using oral laws passed down from generation to generation. There is no written code yet. It is an official orator who states the custom aloud to guide the debates. The sentences pronounced, whether fines, exiles, or even death sentences, are accepted as the expression of the collective will. In a society where pride and honor hold a crucial place, respect for these judgments ensures overall cohesion and avoids the spiral of wild revenge. Beyond the legal aspect, the thing is a major event for the exchange of goods and news. In dispersed communities, it is an opportunity to trade, conclude alliances, arrange marriages. These gatherings also serve as an occasion to sacrifice to the deities, strengthen religious cohesion, and tell epic stories. At the heart of Scandinavian spirituality lies a rich mythology, populated by gods, giants, and fantastic beings. The major deities, such as Odin, Thor, or Freyja, each play a specific role in the balance of the world. Odin is considered the supreme god of wisdom, poetry, and war. He travels the 9 worlds in search of secret knowledge, even sacrificing an eye to access the source of wisdom. Thor, his son, wields the hammer Mjolnir, a symbol of protection and power, and ensures the defense of men against the forces of chaos. Freyja, goddess of love and fertility, reigns over the fertility of the lands, but also embodies the warrior dimension through her participation in the sharing of souls fallen on the battlefield. The founding myths evoke the genesis of the universe from primordial chaos, the creation of the first human couple from tree trunks, and the importance of Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting different realms. A recurring theme is that of Ragnarok, the destiny of the gods, which describes an immense final battle during which gods and monsters will perish before the rebirth of a new world. This cycle of darkness and renewal, rooted in the succession of northern seasons, shapes the collective imagination. It instills in the Scandinavians the feeling that their lives are part of a fragile, cosmic balance, which must be maintained through bravery, loyalty, and devotion. The gods do not form a perfectly unified pantheon, and the legends vary from region to region. Each locality may favor the worship of a particular deity, who protects the community and crops. The absence of sacred texts set in stone lends itself to this fluidity. It is the oral tradition and the action of the skalds, or poets, that ensure the transmission and constant evolution of mythological stories. Under the influence of these beliefs, Scandinavians develop a worldview where bravery and warrior value are linked to individual honor, but also to the blessing of divine powers. Attention to death and the afterlife holds great importance in the Scandinavian mindset. Graves and funeral rituals testify to the belief that the deceased continue to exist in a form of parallel world. Ship burials are often practiced. If the deceased is a person of high rank, they are placed in a ship or boat of varying size, accompanied by valuable objects, weapons, and sometimes servants sacrificed for the occasion. This custom illustrates the belief in setting off on a final journey to other spiritual realms. Rich graves, such as those at Gokstad or Oseberg, dated to the 9th century but continuing an older tradition, prove the symbolic importance of navigation even after death. Other funeral practices exist. Cremation on pyres, a widespread practice in many regions of the north, demonstrates a ritual approach aimed at liberating the soul to the realm of the gods. Funeral objects vary according to the social rank and the type of activity of the deceased. Warriors are buried with their weapons, while artisans may be accompanied by their tools. Women holding a high position, sometimes referred to as sacred housewife, also receive valuable jewelry and domestic utensils. In some cases, the archaeological study of graves also reveals the presence of horses or dogs sacrificed to follow their master. One of the striking features of pre-Viking Scandinavia is the absence of monumental temples or a unified religious institution comparable to the Christian church in Western Europe. Places of worship are often outdoors, near a sacred grove, a revered spring, or a large rock. Religious ceremonies vary according to the regions, orchestrated by local cult leaders or by the jarls themselves. There is no full-time clergy responsible for spreading an established theology. Religion is rather inscribed in daily life and ancestral tradition. This plurality of practices and beliefs partly explains the difficulty that Christian missionaries will later face in quickly uniting the Scandinavians around a new centralized faith. Local mindsets remain attached to the diversity of rites and the independence of leaders in religious matters. Moreover, the idea of submitting one's destiny to a single god without being able to directly negotiate material or warlike favors seems incompatible with the Viking mindset of the time. The sea is omnipresent in Scandinavian life. The rugged coasts of Norway, as well as the multiple islands and straits of Denmark, have long prompted populations to become excellent navigators. Archaeological records indicate already, in the periods before the Viking era, the existence of remarkably constructed wooden boats. Marine carpenters used the technique known as clinker, consisting of overlapping planks of the hull to make the hull both light and flexible. This expertise is passed through generations, refined by direct observation of the sea and by experience gained over voyages. Initially, navigation remains coastal. Sailors coast from fjord to fjord, from natural harbor to natural harbor, relying on terrestrial markers. However, the knowledge of winds, currents, and tides gradually grows, allowing some bolder crews to venture into the open sea or to cross significant capes. Naval innovation therefore goes hand in hand with the spirit of exploration. Long before the Great Raids, the Scandinavians navigate the Baltic Sea, descend the North Sea to trade various products, and accumulate experiences that will later serve distant expeditions. This maritime expertise is not reserved for a military elite. Coastal farmers sometimes have their own small fishing boat, used for transporting goods or supplies. Consequently, coastal inhabitants perceive the sea as a loyal ally, but also a dangerous one. They learn to recognize the signs announcing a storm and to deal with fog or snow. Maritime knowledge is often passed down orally. A father initiates his son into the currents, the reefs to avoid, the cautious coasting along the shore. All this gives rise to a culture that values calculated risk-taking and the ability to navigate in a changing environment, crucial assets for the upcoming Viking period. Thanks to the geographical proximity of the Baltic Sea, early trade exchanges began with other coastal populations. The Saxons settled further south, and the Freyjans, established along the coasts between what is now the northern Netherlands and Germany, maintained commercial and sometimes diplomatic relations with the Scandinavians. For example, furs, honey, wax, and even slaves were exchanged for textiles, salt, or metal objects. Baltic amber, highly sought after for the making of jewelry or ornaments, had been circulating since antiquity and remained a coveted resource. Sites like Hedeby, in what is now southern Denmark, or Birka in Sweden, became important trading centers. Hedeby, located at the interface between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, thrived as early as the 8th century. Archaeological excavations there have unearthed objects from not only other regions of Scandinavia, but also the Carolingian Empire, Slavic countries, and even Mediterranean lands. Birka, founded around the middle of the 8th century, appeared as a gathering and supply point, a starting point towards the Eastern trade networks. Trading activities were not limited to luxury goods, dried fish, seal skins, and construction wood also circulated. The Vikings, even though at this stage they were not yet referred to as such in written sources, gradually became familiar with handling foreign currency, exchanging or melting it down to retrieve the silver as ingots, adopting rudimentary measurement systems, and learning the basics of large-scale negotiation. As commercial links intensified and the ambition of some leaders grew, shipbuilding saw decisive improvements. The Scandinavians refined the clinker technique while introducing innovations in the shape and size of their ships to optimize maneuverability. The ships were now subdivided into different types: the langskip, the longship, ideal for the rapid transport of warriors, and the nar, wider and with a deeper hold, perfect for freight and long merchant voyages. The langskip, the future drakkar in the collective imagination, prioritized speed and shallow draft, allowing it to navigate rivers or land on shallow beaches. It was based on a unique aerodynamic design, with a prow of curved lines, often adorned with a carved figurehead, such as a dragon or a fabulous animal, intended to impress the enemy or honor the sea gods. Thanks to the flexibility of their hulls, these ships were better able to withstand rough seas and embark on long voyages. The Scandinavians also learned to deploy the square sail, added to the oars, to gain speed when the wind was favorable. Until then, sails were less common in the north, probably due to unstable weather conditions. Their adoption changed the game by allowing, for example, quicker crossings of the North Sea or the English Channel. Furthermore, collaboration between ship carpenters and blacksmiths strengthened to multiply metal reinforcements in the ship's structure and develop more resistant fastenings. Improvements also began to be made in hull waterproofing, using wool, tar, and plant fibers beneath the planks. These technical advances were not made in a few years. They resulted from a slow accumulation of expertise, sometimes stimulated by confrontation or contact with other seafaring peoples, such as the Freyjans or the Anglo-Saxons, whose naval accomplishments were studied or even copied. By the end of the 8th century, some Scandinavian clans already had the capability to build fleets capable of navigating long distances and attacking targets both on the coast and inland. This technological superiority would become one of the keys to the success of the Vikings in their subsequent expeditions. Alongside shipbuilding, metal craftsmanship greatly improved in pre-Viking Scandinavia. Blacksmiths acquired the expertise to manufacture stronger blades, better balanced axes, and more effective spearheads. Archaeological excavations reveal a diversified metallurgical art, ranging from rivets and nails for boats to complex jewelry intended to adorn chiefs or their families. Some workshops, benefiting from trade networks, imported high-quality iron or the charcoal necessary for forging, while others produced their own ingots in local mining areas. Weapons hold a central place in the community's esteem. Owning a beautiful sword or an axe adorned with runic motifs is a status symbol, especially for a jarl or a renowned warrior. Round shields, made of wooden planks covered with leather and reinforced with a metal boss at the center, provide reasonable protection while remaining light. The Scandinavians developed alloy-making techniques that ensure a formidable edge, suitable for close combat. Moreover, the ability to repair one's own weapons or those of companions during an expedition demonstrates the high degree of logistical autonomy these communities possessed. The evolution of craftsmanship is not limited to weapons. It also affects the production of everyday objects, such as kitchen utensils, locks, or agricultural tools. All this is intertwined with a network of bartering and sales, whether at seasonal fairs or directly in trading villages. Gradually, manual skills become specialized, contributing to the birth of artisan quarters in some port agglomerations. The wealthy jarls and carls, aware of the strategic importance of quality materials, encourage the growth of the forge and construction trades. This creates a solid foundation for the Scandinavian economy, which relies not only on agriculture or fishing, but also on the manufacture of competitive tools. The major turning point marking the Vikings' dramatic entry into the history of Western Europe is generally associated with the 793 raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne. It may seem strange to place the epicenter of a historical upheaval on an island that seems insignificant at first glance. However, this holy place was crucial for the Anglo-Saxon Christian world. Lindisfarne is located on the northeast coast of England, in a region called Northumbria. This insular monastery, founded in the 7th century, played an important spiritual role. It housed devoted monks who dedicated themselves to copying sacred manuscripts and prayer. In addition, the establishment possessed a significant religious treasure, including relics and precious objects offered by rulers and nobles eager to show their piety. For the Vikings, access by sea presented a dual advantage. First, the geography of Lindisfarne, remote from any significant military garrisons, made any defense almost non-existent. Second, the island provided the opportunity to strike a prestigious symbol of Christianity. The monks had no fortifications to protect themselves from warriors who arrived so suddenly on long and fast ships. It is estimated that the Vikings chose this target both for the ease of the attack and the potential loot. The brutality of the raid, reported in English chronicles of the time, shocked far beyond Northumbria. The monks were killed or enslaved, sacred treasures were plundered, and sanctuaries desecrated. Christians viewed this aggression as an unprecedented threat. Never before had a holy place, considered inviolable, been attacked by an enemy emerging from the sea. In a climate of religious fervor, the event immediately took on the appearance of a cataclysm. Some coastal monasteries began to worry, wondering if these men from the north were not instruments of divine wrath. Meanwhile, political elites, such as Anglo-Saxon kings, realized the existence of a new danger. These unknown warriors, who would later be called Vikings, mastered ships capable of moving much faster than a defensive army could be assembled on land. Following the attack on Lindisfarne, England and Ireland became prime targets for these groups of Norwegians, Danes, or sometimes Swedes in search of wealth and glory. Very quickly, they realized that the Anglo-Saxon coastline offered multiple opportunities due to the absence of a strong central power and the wealth concentrated in the monasteries. In the years following 793, other monasteries and abbeys were subjected to raids. These were often located on the coasts or on rivers easily navigated by boat. Religious establishments were particularly targeted because they housed gold and silver objects, illuminated manuscripts, and reliquaries. Moreover, military protection was rarely assured there, as most monks led peaceful lives. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at that time were divided between Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the center, and Wessex in the south. These political entities could contend with one another, and their lack of solidarity made it easier for the invaders. While Northumbria, where Lindisfarne is located, was the first to suffer these attacks, Mercia and Wessex slowly prepared to strengthen their coasts, but they were unable to immediately stop the threat. Over time, some Vikings found it more advantageous to settle permanently rather than simply raid and depart. This development was especially noticeable in the northern and eastern regions of England, forming a vast territory that historiography calls Danelaw. This area is named as such because it was subject to the law practiced by the Danes. In Danelaw, Scandinavian settlers established farms, settled on fertile lands, and became an integral political factor, negotiating truces or concluding treaties with the Anglo-Saxon kings. Through this mingling, mixed marriages appeared, as well as a form of cultural syncretism. Place names sometimes changed in sound, with the addition of Scandinavian suffixes like by, meaning farm or village. At the same time, Ireland, fragmented into several kingdoms often at war with each other, also attracted Scandinavian adventurers. The case of Dublin is exemplary. By the mid-9th century, the city became a major Viking center, not only as a base for raids into the interior, but also as a hub for the slave trade and exotic products circulating from the British Isles to other parts of Europe. The coasts of England and Ireland were not the only ones to suffer Scandinavian assaults. The Vikings also ventured onto the European continent, particularly in the territory of West Freyja, heir to the Carolingian Empire. They chose major rivers such as the Seine or the Loire to navigate by longship towards wealthy cities and illustrious abbeys. The first attempts at raiding often affected coastal towns, but very quickly, the Vikings understood that with their shallow draft ships, they could sail up rivers to metropolises like Rouen or Paris. In 845, one of the most famous raids resulted in the siege of Paris, the capital of West Freyja. According to several accounts, it was a Viking chief, sometimes associated with the legendary figure of Ragnar Lothbrok, who led the Scandinavian fleet to the gates of Paris. Historians still debate the exact accuracy of the name, as sources of the time use different registers to refer to the Viking commanders. Whatever the case, the attack was so formidable that Charles the Bald, unable to protect the city by force, agreed to pay a hefty ransom. The commonly reported sum is 7,000 pounds of silver. Paying this ransom has immediate and disastrous repercussions for the Carolingian reputation. On one hand, the payment saves Paris from total plunder, but on the other hand, it encourages other Viking hordes to follow Ragnar's path, convinced that the Franks have substantial treasures and will be willing to negotiate to preserve their cities. This lesson, however, encourages the Franks to fortify the capital and strengthen their river defenses, so that in subsequent raids, the Vikings will not find a city as vulnerable. In reaction to these threats, several protective strategies emerge: construction of fortified castles, development of fortified bridges, and sometimes payment of specific tributes called Danegeld, a tax levied to gather the money necessary to buy peace. Over the years, some cities like Tours or Orleans established garrisons capable of repelling or delaying the plunderers, proving that the Franks will not remain passive indefinitely. The Vikings who cross the Seine and other rivers do not settle for aimless plundering. Many of them eventually settle along these waterways, finding fertile soil, easy access to trade, and a milder climate than in their native Scandinavia. The most famous case is that of Normandy, a region in northern France, which still retains a name reminiscent of its Nordic origins, Northmania, the land of the Northmen. In 911, the Carolingian king Charles the Simple, tired of seeing his territories regularly devastated, concludes the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with a Viking chief named Rollo. Charles then grants the Vikings possession of part of Neustria, which will become the Duchy of Normandy, on the condition that Rollo protects the kingdom against further Scandinavian incursions. To formalize this agreement, Rollo gets baptized, a symbolic sign of his adherence to the Christian faith. This baptism is both a political strategy and a step towards the integration of the Vikings into Frankish society. As a vassal of King Charles the Simple, Rollo promises to defend his suzerain's lands against potential new raids. Chronicles recount that during the ceremony, Rollo was supposed to kiss the king's foot to demonstrate his submission. However, this gesture of vassalage being contrary to Scandinavian customs, the Nordic warrior allegedly grabbed the king's foot and brought it to his lips without kneeling, almost toppling the sovereign in the process. While the anecdote seems comical, it nevertheless symbolizes the cultural clash between Vikings and Franks. The story mainly remembers that Normandy became a Viking stronghold integrated into the French feudal system, and that under the impetus of Rollo and his successors, this region would play a strategically significant role in the centuries to come. In the same eras when Danes and Norwegians explore the Atlantic and the western coast of Europe, the Swedish Vikings, often referred to as Varangians, turn eastward. Their longships then navigate the great rivers of Russia, opening trade routes to the Caspian and Black Seas. Unlike the warring raids in the west, the eastern adventure is heavily tinged with commerce. The Varangians, departing from present-day Sweden, travel down the Volga or the Dnieper to trade furs, amber, honey, but also slaves captured along the way. The capitals and markets of the Byzantine Empire, notably Constantinople, the future Istanbul, offer a lucrative outlet for these northern products. Sometimes, agreements are established between these Scandinavian adventurers and the Byzantine emperors, who are occasionally eager to recruit foreign warriors for their personal guard. This leads to the formation of the famous Varangian Guard, an elite corps serving the Emperor of Byzantium and counting within its ranks soldiers of Viking origin. Nonetheless, the influence of the Varangians is not limited to military service. As they traverse the rivers of Eastern Europe, they establish strongholds and ally with local tribes. Around 862, a Varangian chief named Rurik takes control of the city of Novgorod. Historical sources, including the Chronicle of Nestor, present Rurik as the founder of the Rurikid dynasty, destined to lead the future Russia for several centuries. While it is difficult to untangle the part of legend from that of reality, the account highlights the importance of Scandinavian settlement in Slavic regions. Under the governance of his successors, Kiev, located further south, becomes a major political and cultural center. This entity, ruled by princes of Varangian origin, who managed to unite different, often rival Slavic tribes around a nascent state, is then referred to as Kievan Rus. Gradually, these princes themselves convert to Orthodox Christianity, fostering ties with Byzantium. While a branch of Scandinavians lays the groundwork in Eastern Europe, other Norwegian and Danish adventurers pursue an expansion to the west, pushing the boundaries of the known world. These journeys, focused on the search for new lands and resources, successively lead to the colonization of Iceland, Greenland, and, remarkably, to the shores of North America long before Christopher Columbus. The first major milestone of the Viking advance in the North Atlantic is Iceland. According to the sagas, Norwegian navigators arrive on this island around 860, but it is really in the 870s that a significant wave of colonization begins. Many of these exiles flee the growing authority of King Harald Fairhair, unifier of Norway, who imposes his power over formerly independent local chieftains. On site, Iceland proves to be slightly more hospitable than Greenland or northern Scandinavia. Lands can be cultivated, notably along the southern coasts. The settlers raise sheep, horses, and cattle while benefiting from fishing. Quickly, Icelandic society is structured around scattered farms and the Thing, a local assembly where legal and political affairs are discussed. In 930, this system culminates with the Althing, the national parliament, which sat on the plains of Thingvellir. The Icelandic sagas also recount violent family feuds that mark this society. In the saga of Njal the Burned, we discover how the conflicts of honor, clan vendettas, and judicial subtleties can poison settlers' lives. These stories, initially transmitted orally and later written down in the 13th century, reflect a civilization still steeped in pagan traditions and warrior values, despite the formal creation of collective decision-making bodies. Thus, violence is not only reserved for external plundering. Within Iceland itself, honor holds a primary place, and clan leader confrontations frequently end in rivalries passed down over several generations. The sagas have immortalized these episodes, allowing us to understand the importance of oral law and financial compensation mechanisms in these Nordic societies. Despite an initial attachment to Norse mythology, Iceland officially adopts Christianity around the year 1000 through a decision voted at the Althing. The goal was to avoid a civil war between pagans and Christians, and this compromise allowed for a relatively peaceful transition, although pagan practices continued clandestinely for some time. Towards the end of the 10th century, a navigator named Eric the Red, after being banished from Iceland for a blood crime, set out in search of new lands to the west. Benefiting from a slightly milder climatic period than today, he ventured to a large island which he named Greenland, meaning green country. The choice of such a promising name seems to have been a selling point to attract other settlers, as this territory, while offering some pastures on its southern coasts, remains largely hostile. Despite the harsh climate, cattle raising and the trade of products such as walrus ivory or fur allowed several colonies to survive. Initially, regular supplies and exchanges with Iceland or Norway kept these communities alive. The Norse settlers established farms and even built some churches, leading to a Christianization that followed the general trend observed in Scandinavia. The milder weather conditions of the medieval warm period helped with the settlement, but life remained hard, and tensions could arise with the native Inuit populations, although, according to some sources, there were sometimes exchanges of knowledge. The most spectacular exploration of the Vikings is undoubtedly the discovery of North American territories, grouped under the name Vinland in the sagas. The main protagonist of this epic is Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Around the year 1000 or 1001, according to the accounts, Leif Erikson left Greenland and sailed further west, reaching what is likely the coast of Labrador and the island of Newfoundland in present-day Canada. The sagas describe a land rich in natural resources. They talk of vines or wild berries, from which the name Vinland is derived, often translated as land of wine. This name can have multiple interpretations, as some historians believe the Vikings might have mistaken local berries for vines, or that they already used the term wine for various fermented drinks. Regardless, the establishment of a camp, archaeologically identified at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland, proves that Scandinavian settlers actually lived there for a time. However, this Viking presence in North America remains brief. The sagas mention the hostility of the native populations, whom the Vikings called Skraelings. The reasons for conflict remain unclear, but it is likely that trade relations or skirmishes led to a situation too delicate to justify large-scale colonization. Additionally, the distance and lack of reinforcement resources from Greenland made the venture difficult. Eventually, the Scandinavians abandoned these outposts. It would take 5 centuries before other Europeans, led by Christopher Columbus in 1492, would officially rediscover the American continent, redefining world history in a totally different way. At the turn of the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking society underwent significant transformations that would gradually change its political, economic, and religious structures. While the first generations of Vikings are traditionally presented as autonomous warriors, divided into multiple clans and eager for booty, internal evolution over time led to the formation of more centralized kingdoms, a transition from plundering to trade, and a gradual Christianization throughout Scandinavia. One of the first notable examples of this phenomenon can be found in Norway with Harald Hardrada, a leader who, according to traditional accounts, unified large portions of the country starting from the end of the 9th century. The historical sources, mixed with legend, tell that Harald undertook the unification of Norway after vowing not to cut or comb his hair until he had gained unified power. Whatever the exaggerations inherent in the sagas, it is established that this king fought against various Norwegian lords to extend his authority and impose his lineage. In Denmark, a similar figure can be found with Gorm the Old, considered one of the first monarchs seeking to consolidate authority over the entire Jutland and some of the surrounding islands. In Sweden, Olaf Skutkonung is one of the first rulers to be described as a king, covering a vast territory. The era of small autonomous jarls without allegiance to a higher power is sometimes described as a phase of fertile anarchy, as it allowed for almost total freedom in conducting expeditions and managing internal affairs. This plurality of leaders long favored exploration, piracy, and trade, enabling Viking groups to be ready to embark anywhere in search of profit. However, it also led to incessant conflicts between clans fighting for control of the most fertile lands or strategic maritime passage points. With the establishment of a more structured monarchy, this anarchy was gradually replaced by a hierarchical organization. The newly established kings intended to end the murderous rivalries that ravaged their own kingdoms and sometimes exhausted local resources. In Norway, Harald Hardrada launched internal military campaigns to pacify the recalcitrant jarls. These jarls were forced to submit, pay taxes, or leave the country for Iceland or the colonies to the west. Such departures of opponents, in turn, strengthened the power of the sovereign who remained. At the same time, the consolidation of the Scandinavian kingdoms marked the closure of certain spaces of freedom. Local leaders could no longer conduct raids with impunity without informing their king. Negotiations then took place. To be able to mount an expedition, approval from the monarch was required, and often a tribute had to be paid in the form of a portion of the loot. This evolution sparked much discontent, but it also helped make these expeditions more powerful and better coordinated. The end of the near-total autonomy of the jarls thus signaled a major shift. The era when everyone could navigate in their own name was coming to an end, giving way to a more stable system where the central authority dictated the major military and diplomatic directions. As a king's authority emerged in Norway, Denmark, or Sweden, the allegiance of warriors became crucial. Previously, a jarl could easily retain the loyalty of his troop by redistributing the spoils of raids, offering feasts, or enhancing the status of his free men. In a centralized system, these warriors were gradually led to choose between following their local chief or joining the often very prestigious royal retinue. Indeed, the king could offer much more attractive opportunities: participation in large-scale conflicts, potential distribution of conquered lands, matrimonial alliances, and above all, official recognition of a higher rank. Many talented Vikings also entered the service of foreign kings, as evidenced by the Varangians, engaged in the Byzantine Imperial Guard. This rise in power of the Scandinavian kings also led to the creation of a court and rudimentary administrative functions, tax collectors, military advisors, naval warehouse managers, and so on. Skilled workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, were frequently requisitioned to work for the royal service. Merchants and artisans saw this as an opportunity to sell their goods and benefit from a protected internal market. Gradually, loyalty to the monarch took precedence over the former personal fidelity to the local jarl. Overall, this evolution encouraged the formation of more robust states, capable of forging international alliances and participating in the major European power games. While among the Vikings, commercial transactions initially often relied on bartering or the weighing of ingots and silver jewelry, there was a gradual adoption of foreign currency. Scandinavian merchants traveling in the Carolingian Empire in England or to the Islamic territories of the East became accustomed to handling minted coins, be they Abbasid dinars, dirhams, or Western deniers. In many Viking treasures unearthed by archaeologists, there is a strong presence of Arab coins, mainly dirhams, from regions around the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea. These coins reached Scandinavia via trade routes through Kievan Rus, used by the Varangians. The Scandinavians did not always reuse these coins as they were. They could melt them down or transform them into silver ingots to accurately count the amount of metal. However, the very idea of currency as an exchange tool, rather than simple bartering, gradually became familiar to the Scandinavian population. In parallel, gold and silver also play a symbolic role in Viking society, notably to assert social rank. Necklaces, bracelets, or silver rings given by a chief to his men strengthen the bond of allegiance. With the establishment of more centralized states, the circulation of precious metals is better controlled. Land or commercial taxes paid in silver become feasible, thereby enhancing the ability of kings to amass a treasure. This silver is then used to pay mercenaries or to negotiate peace with potential invaders. For a long time, the Viking reputation relies on their extraordinary naval mobility. These experienced sailors can land on any shore, sail up rivers aboard their shallow draft longships, and then disappear with their loot before local forces can react. However, economic evolution increasingly favors the establishment of colonies or trading posts abroad and territorial control. This settlement also translates into social changes. Newly established jarls or counts on fiefs are distinguished less by their maritime feats than by their ability to administer domains, collect taxes, and enforce the law. The following generations, born in Denmark or in the colonies, consider themselves less as adventurers headed out and more as members of a community bound by feudal structures. Gradually, this process contributes to the integration of the Vikings into a flourishing medieval Europe, where the figure of the great landowner and vassal gradually supplants that of the clan chief and his free men, perpetually ready to set out to sea. One of the most significant changes within the Viking world is the conversion to Christianity, a phenomenon that begins as early as the 9th century, but takes on decisive magnitude during the 10th and 11th centuries. Initially, only a few chiefs are baptized to seal alliances with Christian rulers or to facilitate negotiations. For example, some Danish kings choose to convert to gain recognition from the Carolingian Empire or other European powers. Missionaries, mainly from England and Germany, play a leading role. They strive to convert the elites, knowing that if a king or jarl accepts baptism, his court is likely to follow. In Norway, Christianization is closely linked with the rise of royalty. King Olaf Tryggvason, late 10th century, and King Olaf II Haraldsson, known as Saint Olaf in the 11th century, are both renowned for their zeal in imposing Christianity, often by force. The sagas recount stories of mass conversions, where individuals are sometimes forced to choose between baptism or exile. In Sweden, the progress is slower, as the central regions, like Svealand, are more resistant, while areas near Lake Mälaren open up earlier to Western influences. Missionary bishops, supported by the Pope, strive to establish Christian communities and appoint local priests. Denmark, with the influence of Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth, becomes an early center for Christianization, facilitated by its geographical proximity to the Germanic Empire. Christianization has a major impact on Viking society. Initially, it theologically condemns the looting of churches and monasteries. Over time, attacking sacred places is no longer tolerated, even among the Scandinavian chiefs themselves. Christian slaves, who could previously be captured and sold without issue, receive a certain religious protection, reducing the economic appeal of this type of profit. This gradual weakening of the practice of slavery contributes to redefining labor relations and social hierarchies, especially as the Church argues that the enslavement of fellow believers constitutes a sin. Furthermore, the gradual abandonment of pagan rites and the construction of wooden churches, a symbol of newfound fervor, illustrate a profound identity change. The festivals of the liturgical cycle, such as Easter or Christmas, replace the great pagan ceremonies honoring Odin, Thor, or Freyja. The animal sacrifice customs, once essential during major community cults, are denounced by the Church, which encourages instead the organization of pilgrimages or offerings to saints. Scandinavian society, once focused on ancestor worship and the veneration of deities from a rich mythology, gradually finds itself anchored to the Greco-Roman heritage claimed by medieval Western Christianity. On the political front, this religious transformation favors the international recognition of Scandinavian rulers. To negotiate with the Frankish kings, German emperors, or the Pope in Rome, being recognized as a legitimate Christian ruler is advantageous. Scandinavian monarchs exploit this dimension to consolidate their authority, surrounding themselves with bishops from continental Europe and sometimes creating new episcopal seats, such as Nidaros in Norway. Being crowned according to Christian rites significantly reinforces their legitimacy, to the detriment of pagan leaders considered external to the community of Christian kings. Despite the constant rise of Christianity, pagan resistance remains strong in some regions where the worship of the old gods is ingrained in local identity. In central Sweden, Uppland, pagan rituals continue well beyond the 10th century, and there are known moments of rebellions against Christianized sovereigns. In Norway, the authoritarianism of Olaf Tryggvason, or Olaf II, who forced conversions through violence, also led to revolts. Yet, over the decades, these resistances erode for several reasons. The Church has a structured missionary organization, kings use all political levers to constrain opponents, and populations realize that Christianity facilitates commercial and diplomatic integration with the rest of Europe. Moreover, there is a certain syncretism. Some pagan traditions are incorporated into Christian practice to make the new religion more acceptable to former believers. There are, for example, stories suggesting that Thor and other warrior gods are assimilated into saints fighting the enemy. Seasonal festivals are sometimes continued by giving them a Christian connotation while removing bloody sacrifices. In Denmark, mixed graves are found, where Christian symbols, crosses, are seen alongside pagan objects or ancient runes. Finally, this assemblage of religious, political, and social elements leads to the spiritual unification of Scandinavia with the rest of the Christian world of the West. By the 11th century, Scandinavian kingdoms are considered to fully belong to the Latin Christendom, just like Freyja, England, or the German states. In the 14th century, a long period of cooling begins in the northern hemisphere, commonly referred to as the Little Ice Age. This phenomenon, whose first signs gradually appear at the end of the 13th century, becomes pronounced and significantly perceptible in the 14th century, with harsher winters and often short, wet summers. For a modern observer, it is sometimes difficult to assess the extent of the impact of this climate change in the medieval period. However, archaeological sources and studies of tree rings, dendrochronology, along with the analysis of ice cores, indicate that there was a sufficiently pronounced cooling to affect societies residing in already hostile regions, particularly in Greenland. The Norse settlers, who arrived in Greenland under the leadership of Eric the Red at the end of the 10th century, were highly dependent on the climate for their sustenance. Their settlements, called Eastern Settlement and Western Settlement, were based on a form of agro-pastoralism adapted to Nordic conditions. They primarily raised cattle, sheep, and goats, while a few cereals, especially barley, were cultivated in the most favorable grassy areas. However, as temperatures dropped and the ice cap expanded, pastures became scarce and deteriorated. The growing season for vegetation shrank, making it increasingly difficult to feed livestock. Moreover, more frequent winter storms and drifting ice along the coast of Greenland made maritime communications more dangerous. This climate deterioration led to critical situations for the Norse settlers. The livestock more often died of starvation, and hunting seals or caribou was too unpredictable to feed the entire population. Documents from the 14th century, though rare, suggest that the inhabitants of Greenland faced recurring famines or severe shortages. Gradually, the dependence on imports from Iceland or Norway became even more pronounced, creating a vicious cycle. The colder climate complicated the sea journey, which in turn limited the supplies needed to survive in this climate. The settlers thus found themselves in an ecological and logistical deadlock, paving the way for the irreversible decline of their communities. In parallel with the more extreme climatic conditions, the Greenlandic colonies had to manage an increasingly pronounced isolation. Since their establishment, these Norse communities maintained regular ties with Old Europe, primarily through Iceland and Norway. Viking ships normally navigated between these territories to exchange vital goods: wood, iron, handicrafts, cereals, and even wine. In return, Greenland exported skins, walrus ivory, and sometimes fur. This movement, already perilous, depended on a maritime season sufficiently free from ice and contrary winds. However, with the onset of the Little Ice Age, the navigable period was significantly reduced. Ocean currents altered by the more extensive ice made the crossing much riskier. Even experienced Icelandic navigators hesitated to take to the sea to supply Greenland, whose inhabitants became increasingly dependent on rare convoys. Over the years, the flow of ships dwindled to the point of almost disappearing. Some summers, no ships reached the isolated Norse farms. Icelandic sources sometimes mention the disappearance of ships swallowed by ice or storm, which added to the general fear. The vital link between Iceland and Greenland was thus practically broken in the second half of the 14th century. Without the possibility of receiving spare metal parts for their tools, seeds, or even construction wood, the settlers no longer had the resources needed to maintain their homes, enclosures, and boats. The rare commercial exchanges could not compensate for this progressive rupture. As trade declined, the population, already weakened by an excessively harsh climate, realized that their way of life, established there for several generations, was becoming unsustainable. Chronicles of the time indicate a lack of information about the fate of the last Norse families in Greenland, suggesting that some left these hostile lands to return to Iceland or attempt other emigration, while others, much more vulnerable, did not survive. In this context of climate deterioration, the Norse settlers also had to face competition from the Inuit populations, belonging to the so-called Thule culture, who arrived in Greenland from the Arctic. The Inuits, hunter-gatherers, accustomed to exploiting marine and terrestrial resources in polar environments, had a formidable capacity for adaptation. They knew how to make lightweight, maneuverable kayaks, craft warm clothing from sealskin or caribou skin, and build semi-subterranean shelters suited to the extreme cold. In contrast, the Norse still largely relied on an agricultural exploitation model inherited from Norway, unsuitable for the rigors of an increasingly polar climate. Tensions between the two populations are not documented in detail, but certain written and material sources suggest that the Norse saw these Skraelings, the name they gave to the Arctic indigenous peoples, as rivals for access to resources like walrus ivory or caribou hunting. The Inuit, on their part, might have seen the Norse farms as an occasional means to obtain iron or tools. There may have been some trade exchanges or certain violent raids, but the essential difference lay in their radically different adaptations to the cold. While the Norse settlers were increasingly struggling to grow barley, the Inuit fished and hunted in a nomadic manner, gaining a decisive advantage in this hostile environment. Further east, in most European lands and on the North Atlantic coasts, the rise of local resistances constitutes another decisive factor in the progressive decline of Viking power. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the surprising speed and mobility of Viking ships had instilled fear in regions ill-prepared to repel swift maritime attacks. However, as Viking raids multiplied, the attacked territories developed more effective defensive strategies. Monasteries, frequently targeted, began surrounding themselves with walls or relocating to areas harder to access. Local political powers, be they kings or feudal lords, realized that it was better to build or reinforce fortifications. In England, Alfred the Great, 9th century, is credited with implementing an elaborate system of beers, fortified places, capable of rapidly mobilizing garrisons in case of a raid. In Freyja, prolonged sieges, like that of Paris in 885-886, eventually demonstrated that large Viking flotillas could be resisted with solid fortifications and adequate defensive organization. This cumulative effect led to the loss of the initial advantage held by the Norsemen. Coastal populations were no longer panicked at the first appearance of longships. They were now alert and possessed lookout systems or messengers to rapidly mobilize local forces. Over time, Western Europe and even some regions in the east, Baltic Shore or Slavic lands, adapted their tactics, ending the relative impunity of which the Vikings had benefited. Maritime raids were no longer a guarantee of automatic success, especially where solid walls, trained garrisons, and counterattack fleets emerged. For many Scandinavian leaders, the decision to set out on an expedition originally rested on the prospect of quick and substantial revenue. Monasteries, churches, and coastal villages held religious treasures, valuable items, food stocks or livestock, and populations that could be sold as slaves. However, over the decades, increased defenses, fortified structures, and improved military coordination in targeted regions reduced the profitability of these raids. Attacking a fortified city now required time, human losses, and more substantial siege equipment, contradicting the usual lightning raid tactic. At the same time, some Vikings realized that legal or semi-legal trade could prove more lucrative in the long run. Increasingly, Scandinavians shifted from piracy to negotiation, establishing lasting trade contacts. The routes connecting the Baltic, the North Sea, and even the Byzantine Empire via the river networks of Russia, the Varangian routes, were conducive to the exchange of furs, metal, wood, fish, or amber. To these products was added the sale of slaves, certainly, but in more structured forms, with stable trade where margins could become regular. Scandinavian colonies transformed into thriving trading towns. In Hedeby, in present-day northern Germany, Birka, in Sweden, or Dublin, in Ireland, markets attracted merchants and caravans. Instead of risking an uncertain battle, it became more sensible to tax the flow of goods or to make agreements with local powers. Gradually, this structural change meant that pillaging took a back seat as there developed a genuine interest in settlement, agriculture, and above all, profitable trade exchanges. When the temptation for raiding arose, the risks, too high, were no longer as easily compensated by the loot taken. It was hardly surprising to see the old tradition of pillaging transform into a more flexible economic model based on integration into market networks. Beyond the defensive measures adopted by the attacked countries, medieval Europe experienced other forms of piracy that were not limited exclusively to the Scandinavians. The Saracens, a name given to various Muslim groups operating in the Mediterranean, carried out coastal raids in Italy, Provence, or Spain, while former Frisian or Saxon pirates roamed the North Sea. As a sort of norm of piracy established in the medieval world, the Vikings lost their status as unprecedented terror. Indeed, the rise of better structured kingdoms and the multiplication of armed men in coastal areas also allowed the fight against other maritime raiders. The Vikings were no longer seen as the sole and feared enemy, but were now part of a complex landscape of wars and piracy, where negotiations, fluctuating alliances, and treaties prevailed. The reputation of Viking violence remained, but it was no longer an equally effective tool of surprise. The armed response of the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, or other regional princes was no different from Viking expeditions, as these leaders could themselves engage in raids or surprise attacks if it served their interests. Under the impetus of the Norman conquerors, England integrated into a political and cultural space dominated by the noble elite from the continent. Scandinavian kings, on the other hand, found themselves gradually relegated to a secondary role in European affairs. While they were once feared for their longships sailing the seas, they now faced equally experienced rivals with feudal armies and fleets capable of competing for maritime supremacy. The Normans, heirs of the Viking tradition, thus became formidable competitors, demonstrating that Scandinavian continuity now expressed itself from within the feudal world, rather than through the lens of raiding. Finally, to fully grasp the naval and commercial competition established at the end of the Viking era, it is important to highlight the spectacular expansion of the Hanseatic League, an association of German-speaking merchant towns around the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. From the 12th century onward, cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, or Rostock rapidly developed thanks to the trade of salt, grain, fish, and forestry products. In just 2 centuries, the Hanse, as it is called, became a powerful commercial network, with commercial outposts and privileges granted in many European ports, reaching England and the Scandinavian countries. This new economic power, based on robust merchant ships, fleets organized for mutual protection, and skillful diplomacy, altered maritime balances in Northern Europe. Scandinavian kings, who previously could derive significant profit from their trades or from taxing goods transiting through their territories, now faced a supranational entity capable of negotiating, even imposing its conditions. Moreover, the Hanse did not hesitate to use economic reprisals. A port opposing its interests could be boycotted, finding itself isolated and ruined. In this context, the ancient Viking naval superiority is no longer relevant. Hanseatic ships gradually dominate the waters of the Baltic, controlling trade routes to Novgorod in modern-day Russia, Scandinavia, and even the Atlantic coast. The merchants of the Hanseatic League form a cosmopolitan elite, benefiting from advances in maritime insurance, accounting, and municipal administration. Their financial power eclipses the Scandinavian tradition, which, although solid, was less centralized and less equipped to face international competition. As the Hanseatic League consolidates its hegemony, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian monarchs occasionally attempt to ally or limit Hanseatic influence, but it is difficult for them to compete with such a network. In the mid-11th century, the Scandinavian world is quite different from what it was during the first Viking raids, initiated nearly 3 centuries earlier. The great Norse chieftains have gradually converted to Christianity. The kingdoms of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark assert themselves, and the very idea of invading Western Europe through repeated plundering no longer sparks the same enthusiasm as before. Nevertheless, some warriors continue to lead adventurous lives, still bearing the imprint of the Viking legacy in distant lands. Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, is one of those iconic figures who perpetuate the image of the daring Scandinavian conqueror, ready to traverse seas and lands to expand his power. Born around 10 or 15, Harald Hardrada belongs to the Norwegian nobility and is connected to King Olaf II of Norway. During his adolescence, Harald fights alongside Olaf at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, which results in Olaf's defeat and death. Injured and forced to flee, the young Harald seeks refuge abroad. In this context of frequent power struggles in Scandinavia, he chooses exile and sets sail for the Kievan Rus, a territory where Swedish Vikings, called Varangians, had settled since the 9th century, creating a political and commercial dynamic in the region. At that time, the Kievan Rus was governed by princes ruling from the cities of Novgorod and Kiev, and Harald finds a favorable reception at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. With diplomatic and military talents, Harald Hardrada soon becomes known for his bravery. He is quickly recruited into the prestigious Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire. This elite troop, largely composed of Scandinavians, serves directly under the emperor in Constantinople. For several years, Harald travels across Asia Minor and various regions of the Mediterranean, fighting on behalf of Byzantium. The Varangian Guard, known for its combat effectiveness and strict discipline, is a highly regarded mercenary corps. Many Scandinavians take advantage of this to acquire gold, prestige, and extraordinary martial experience. This is precisely what happens to Harald. He accumulates significant wealth and a reputation that already exceeds Norwegian borders. His adventures recount that his military training was perfected on numerous battlefields, from the eastern steppes to the Byzantine fortresses of the Levant. Around 1046, after leaving the Varangian Guard, Harald finally returns to Norway. He then claims his royal heritage and initially shares power with Magnus the Good, son of Olaf II. Upon Magnus's death, he becomes the sole king of Norway, deciding to pursue an ambitious expansion policy. His implacable nature, combining diplomatic cunning and power ambition, earns him the nickname Hardrada, meaning the severe. His project goes beyond Norwegian borders. In his imagination, any throne susceptible to conquest is a legitimate objective. He then leads various military campaigns, seeking to consolidate his authority, extend his network of alliances, and increase his war treasure. His reputation is built on his combat skill, determination, and the fear he inspires in his adversaries. Although Scandinavia is now largely Christianized, the spirit of the old Vikings survives through such personalities, ready to set forth on Europe's roads, even in the heart of the 11th century. In 1066, England is going through a delicate political situation. King Edward the Confessor died in January of the same year, leaving no child to succeed him. Several claimants are competing to ascend the throne. Among them, Harald Godwinson, the main Anglo-Saxon nobleman, is crowned almost immediately after Edward's death. However, this succession is not unchallenged. Other European sovereigns, sensing the opportunity to seize a rich and powerful kingdom, put forward their own claims. William, Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor, believes he is the legitimate heir and prepares to cross the Channel. In the north, Harald Hardrada, convinced that England should be his by virtue of old treaties and alliances, joins the fray. Harald Hardrada is not alone. Tostig Godwinson, brother of Harald Godwinson, but exiled and in conflict with him, offers his support to the Norwegian king. Tostig hopes to regain his former title of Earl of Northumbria and reclaim his place in the English political landscape. Encouraged by this alliance, Harald Hardrada assembles a significant fleet of longships and lands in northern England, aiming to strike quickly and forcefully. On September 20th, 1066, during the Battle of Fulford near the city of York, Hardrada and Tostig's forces achieve an initial victory against local troops led by Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. This victory allows the invaders to advance further inland in England, with the confidence that their quest will soon succeed. Having conquered York without much difficulty, Harald Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson expect to receive hostages and extract a significant tribute to spare the region. Buoyed by their recent triumph, they do not prepare for an immediate counteroffensive. However, Harald Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king, reacts with surprising speed. Having learned of the Norwegian invasion, he opts for a forced march from southern England to the north, covering about 300 kilometers in record time. This bold maneuver allows him to surprise Harald Hardrada's army on September 25th, 1066, on the banks of the River Derwent near Stamford Bridge. Accounts from the time emphasize the element of surprise. Many Norwegians reportedly left their armor on the ships, believing they would not have to fight so soon. Harald Hardrada, witnessing the unexpected arrival of the English army, attempts to rally his men. A fierce battle ensues. According to some chronicles and sagas, a Norwegian warrior single-handedly blocked the bridge with his axe, killing several adversary soldiers before succumbing, illustrating the sometimes legendary heroism attributed to the Vikings. Despite this fierce defense, Harald Hardrada, is killed by an arrow to the throat, while Tostig also perishes in the fighting. Deprived of their charismatic leader, the Norwegian army becomes disorganized and is decimated. A few survivors return to sea with barely 20% of the ships used for the invasion, a figure revealing the scale of the defeat. This Battle of Stamford Bridge, won by Harold Godwinson, holds significant symbolic importance. It is often seen by historians as marking the effective end of the major Viking invasions in Western Europe. For nearly 3 centuries, these formidable warriors had terrorized territories subjected to their raids. Now, the time of surprise, of sudden attacks, and systematic plundering comes to an end. Ironically, Harold Godwinson, victor at Stamford Bridge, must barely recover from this battle. 3 weeks later, he faces another invasion, that of William of Normandy, who lands on the southern coast of England. Exhausted from the fight against the Norwegians and forced into a second forced march across the country, Harold confronts William the Conqueror on October 14, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings. Harold Godwinson's defeat and death at Hastings seal the future of England. William, of Viking ancestry through his forebears, takes control of the kingdom and establishes a new dynasty there. Thus, the last great Viking conquest effort is stifled by the Anglo-Saxon victory at Stamford Bridge, but the English crown, nevertheless, fails to resist the push from Normandy. Beyond this irony, the episode reminds us how these Scandinavian cousins, settled in Normandy since the early 10th century, turn into major players on the European scene, perpetuating in another form the expansionist ambition once associated with warriors from the north. After the disappearance of war leaders like Harald Hardrada, and more broadly after the retreat of major overseas expeditions, Scandinavia refocuses on internal development. From the second half of the 11th century, the kings of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark worked to consolidate their power. The Vikings, in the classical sense of the term, therefore no longer exist as a conquering force in the era of the great Christian Scandinavian kings. The decisive event, from the military history viewpoint, remains the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when Harald Hardrada, the last great conqueror following the Viking tradition, meets his death against Harold Godwinson. For many historians, this date marks the twilight of large-scale Viking adventures, while heirs of these men from the north continue to reign elsewhere, in Normandy, in England, after the Norman conquest, in Sicily through southern Normans. They do so in forms already integrated into feudal and Christian Europe. The spectacular raids and longships are but a memory, celebrated and magnified by poems, sagas, and legends. It is on this new order that the Viking era closes, leaving behind a considerable cultural and historical legacy. The runes, mythological tales, epic sagas, naval prowess, and woodcraft have shaped the enduring image of the Vikings in the collective memory. This epic, as brief as it was striking, leaves an indelible mark on world history, reminding us that the Viking adventure was above all an impetus of adaptation, navigation, and integration. Initially daring adventurers, then founders of principalities, and finally recognized kings, the Scandinavians complete their transformation at the transition between the 11th and 12th centuries, when all of Europe embraces feudalism and the papacy forges ties with new Christianities. The myth itself will only grow, fueling the fascination for these long-haul navigators who, for several centuries, knew how to push the limits of the known world before making way for other emerging great powers at the end of the Middle Ages.